All right, so let's go ahead and get started for the day. So looking at the poll, it looks like the majority of you are looking to take the exam in 2020 or possibly later. So props to all of you for certainly attending this webinar early and starting to think about the MCAT exam. It is quite a beast of an exam, so certainly one that you want to start thinking about early. We also have quite a number of you as well who are looking to take the exam this summer. So many of you taking it in August or September, which is great because you're still going to have a few months to prepare for your exam. And we also have a few of you who looks like your test date's coming up real soon in June or July. So certainly you're going to be doing a lot of practice questions right now. So hopefully the feedback and advice we're going to be able to give you today is going to be helpful. So let's get started. One thing I want to mention real quick is we are going to be providing a lot of useful information in this presentation, but we're also going to be answering your questions. So if you take a look at the GoToWebinar panel on the side, you'll notice that there's an area where you can enter in your questions. So feel free to enter in questions at any point during the presentation, and at the end, we're going to be answering all of your questions. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be discussing the best practice materials for the MCAT and how to use them. So to start, I want to go ahead and introduce our hosts. So of course, there is myself. My name is Ken. I am the Director of MCAT Programming for Med School Coach. And today we have with us two fantastic pre-medical and soon-to-be medical students, Rishav and Catherine. So if each of you want to go ahead and introduce yourself. Rishav, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Ken. Hi, guys. So my name is Rishav. I graduated from Duke University in 2016, and I studied biology and chemistry there. After I graduated from college, I worked as a high school chemistry and physics teacher for a few years. This August, I'll be starting med school at Johns Hopkins. Yep. So it's nice to meet everyone.
Awesome. Congrats, Rishav, on your med school acceptance. My name is Catherine, and I'm a current applicant. I went to the University of Miami, and I graduated last year. And during my gap year, I'm working as an MCAT tutor, and I'm also doing some volunteering and things like that.
All right, great. So as you can see, Rishav and Catherine have both achieved among the highest of MCAT scores in the nation, so they really know what it takes to score well on the exam. They're also two of our superstar MCAT tutors for Med School Coach, so they have a very impressive record for helping students improve their scores on the exam. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into the presentation. We're going to start first by looking at the outline. So first, we're going to start off with a quick introduction to the MCAT exam for those of you who aren't familiar with the format of the test. And from there, we're going to go into the tips and strategies. So talking about the best practice materials and how to use the full-length practice test. And then we'll chat a bit about how Med School Coach Tutoring can help and wrap things up with a roundtable Q&A where we'll be answering your questions. So to start, here we have a slide on the MCAT exam. So what you can take note is that the exam has 4 sections: the Chem Phys section, the Car section, the Bio-Chem section, and the Psych-Soc section. Each section also has much longer names, but sort of the shorthand that I was using is what most pre-medical students will use. Now, you'll also see on this diagram that the MCAT is scored for each section, and each section has a minimum score of 118 with a maximum score of 132. If you count the number of numbers between 118 to 132, you'll notice that there are 15 numbers. So that means that MCAT is on a 15-point scale for each section of the exam. An average score is a 125 right in the middle. And this is great for medical schools because if a student gets an average score on all 4 sections of the exam, they get a 500. So that makes it very easy for medical schools to identify what students are above average, meaning they have a 500 or higher score, or if they are below average, so they have something in the 4s, so 490s or 480s. Now, these scores, of course, is giving you some idea of the average score of 500. Of course, getting into medical school, you do need to be able to beat the average. In fact, for the most recent application cycle, the average MCAT score for matriculants, the students who got into medical schools, was around a 511, 512. So you have to score a bit above the average score if you want a good shot of getting into medical school. And a few minor points, as you can see here down the bottom, the MCAT has a combination of passage-based questions and freestanding questions. This is actually going to play into a very big factor into our discussion today, that MCAT is not just a test of rote memorization, just asking you, can you tell me this scientific fact and that scientific fact? It's actually a test of application. So you do need to know all those scientific concepts, but to get questions right, you're going to be asked to apply your knowledge of science to new situations and new concepts and content introduced in passages to figure out the answers. And as it turns out, it's not so simple. And of course, every question on the MCAT is worth the same amount of points, and there is no guessing penalty. All right. So with that, let's move on to Rishav. So Rishav is going to give us some fantastic tips about best MCAT materials and how to use them. So Rishav, it's all yours.
Sure, thanks, Ken. So my first tip in terms of what resources to use for studying for the MCAT is that you should review cover to cover a set of MCAT prep books. And there are a lot of books out there. I'd say my favorite are probably Princeton Review or Kaplan. But you should get a set of those books and you should read those books cover to cover. And so the reason I say that is that some students, because they're so eager to get through their studying, will say that, well, I really understood this topic or this chapter when I was doing my college course, or I just did this college course, so biochemistry is really fresh. And so they'll skim over those chapters. And I think that's something that you should really avoid. That it turns out that there's a lot of things that the MCAT will focus on that your class may not have really talked about much. And there's a lot of things that you might have talked about a lot in your class that the MCAT will not cover. And so to understand how the MCAT approaches this content, you should read every single chapter without skipping or skimming any. After you read every chapter, you should really check for understanding. And so that means doing some problems related to that chapter to see if you understood what you actually just read. And so usually just the questions at the end of every chapter are sufficient for that. Usually like 10 to 20 questions at the end of every chapter. If you're getting most of those questions right, you can assume that you understand that chapter pretty well. If you're getting most of them wrong, then you have to go back and find another resource to review that chapter or that content. As you read the chapters, you should take notes. When you take notes, you're kind of forced to distill the main points of what you just read in your own words. And I think that oftentimes helps students really understand what they just read and remember what they read for the long term. And then for most of my students, I recommend that they have some time every week that's blocked off. And sometimes it's like, Sunday mornings or Saturday mornings or Sunday evenings, that time is blocked off just to review their notes. So every week you should be doing some review in addition to reading new content. And then the last thing I'll say about reading the books is that while you read, you should really vary which subject you read every day. And so what I mean by that is that some students, the way that they want to study is that they'll maybe do all their chemistry reading first, and then they'll move to physics, and then they'll move to organic chemistry, and then they'll move to biology. And so they'll do one subject at a time, finish that subject, and move on to the next subject. And the problem with that is that the MCAT doesn't work like that. The MCAT, it turns out, when you have a passage on the MCAT, that oftentimes you'll have to think about multiple different topics across different subjects within the span of that one passage. And so in order to start seeing connections between different subjects, you should be reading multiple different subjects concurrently. And the other reason that I say that reading one topic at a time is a bad idea is that, for example, if you start off with just physics and you'd spend the first 2 weeks doing nothing but physics, that means that you're going to have after that first 2 weeks, you're going to have months where you're doing other stuff, but you haven't done any physics. And so by the time you're done with your books, your physics is already rusty. And so in order to keep up with all those different skills, you should be covering all the subjects every week. And so do a little bit of every subject every day. So my next tip is about practice. So you've done the content review, now you're ready to practice, do full-length exams, doing practice questions. And what I'd say is that you should really only rely on the best available practice questions. And I know that I said earlier that the prep companies have good books. What I'll tell you is that I don't really like the questions that the prep companies come up with, and I don't like the exams that the prep companies come up with. That really the best questions to practice with are the questions that are released by this organization called the AAMC. They're the people that make the actual MCAT, and they have a pretty exhaustive set of full-length exams and practice questions that they've released. And these are really your gold standard for practicing. And so make sure you focus your practice around these questions that the AAMC releases. And when you take these questions, I highly recommend simulating really actual testing conditions, so you get a sense of what the MCAT is like. And so some of the conditions that I might recommend are, for example, when you do the questions, do them at about 59 questions per set, and spend about 95 minutes doing those 59 questions, because that's how long an MCAT science section is, and 95 minutes is how long they give you to do those 59 questions on the actual MCAT. When you do these questions, make sure you do the math without a calculator, because on the physics, on the chem phys section, or on any section of the MCAT, you don't get a calculator. When you're doing these questions, you probably want to go somewhere, you probably want to do them somewhere that's quiet, but not too quiet, because in the actual MCAT date, you're going to be surrounded by a lot of people coughing and typing and clicking. And so maybe do it in the library, not in the silence of your own room. When you're doing these questions, maybe when you're doing a full-length exam, you should try and wake up at 7 a.m. in the morning and start your test by 8, because that's what you're going to have to do on the actual MCAT date, to simulate actual testing conditions. And then when you're done doing the questions, I'd recommend that you go back and review the questions really thoroughly. So you should review every single question that obviously the questions you got wrong. We should also be reviewing any question where you weren't 100% sure about every single answer choice. So if you're able to get the question right, but involved some luck or some guessing, so you narrowed it down by process of elimination, but you don't know why the actual answer is correct, or you narrowed it down to two answer choices and you guessed correctly. Well, any question where you weren't 100% sure, you should be going back and reviewing. And when you review, some students think that review means you read the solution to that problem and then you move on to the next problem, and that's not what I mean about by review. When you're reviewing, by the time you're done reviewing that one question, you should feel confident that if you see another question similar to it on a similar topic, that you would be able to get another new question correct. And so oftentimes that means that when you're doing review, if you see that you're getting a lot of acid-base questions wrong, or if you're getting a lot of electrochemistry questions wrong, then it may be that you have to take a break from just reviewing questions, pull out your notes, pull out your textbook, and go back and review those topics and really just review the content, not just the questions. So that's my second tip. Oh, and my last tip is that you should really make use out of a lot of high quality free resources that exist online and offline. And so one resource that I really like that's free is Khan Academy. So you might have used Khan Academy when you were studying for college courses. It turns out that under the somewhat guidance of the AAMC, the company that makes the MCAT, that Khan Academy has also generated an entire course of content review videos specifically for the MCAT. And they're really, usually I think the videos are really good, they're really detailed, they're really comprehensive. And so you want to supplement your content review with the Khan Academy videos. This is especially useful if you encounter a chapter that you read in the book and that chapter still didn't make much sense. In those cases, I highly recommend going and watching the Khan Academy videos on those subjects to see it explained in a slightly different way. Another resource that I really like is Reddit. That there's a MCAT subreddit within the Reddit like social media, and that there's a lot of really great crowdsourced resources that are posted on there. And so like, for example, I just mentioned those Khan Academy videos, that there are a lot of kind people that have watched all those Khan Academy videos and taken really good notes in all those Khan Academy videos. And so if you don't have the time to watch all the Khan Academy videos, you might be able to just read those notes. There are some really great flashcards that people have made and posted on Reddit. And so there's a lot of great crowdsourced resources that are available on Reddit. So I'd highly recommend that you look through there and you kind of browse through those. Another kind of free resource is that it turns out a lot of prep companies will offer some free trials or free samples of their work. Next Step and UWorld come to mind. That these are companies that will allow you to try out the questions that they generate or the exams that they generate. And I said that the AAMC questions are the gold standard, but if you exhaust those AAMC questions, you might want to try out these free trials or free samples and see if you like these questions as a supplement to the AAMC questions. And then the last free resource that really was useful for me when I was studying is just taking things that I struggle memorizing and explaining those things to a friend or family member. I remember for me, it was like I had a lot of trouble memorizing the hormonal and the uterine cycles that occur during menstruation. And just literally drawing those charts out and explaining them to my girlfriend helped me memorize them for a long time, and it helped me do better on the MCAT. And so if you're having trouble memorizing something, try teaching it to somebody else. So those are my tips for resources to study for the MCAT. Thanks, guys.
All right, thank you, Rishav. And of course, all fantastic tips. And before we move on to Catherine's tips, I want to go ahead and set up another poll. So we're going to have a question here of how are you planning on preparing for the MCAT? So if all of you want to go ahead and fill in your response, and then afterwards we can chat about it real quick. All right, so looking at our responses, let's see what we have. So we have the majority of people who are looking to self-study for the MCAT, and then we have some people looking at courses, tutoring, and not sure. I would say this is very accurate of not just the people who are attending our webinars, but really the MCAT population out there. So the vast majority of people who do take the MCAT each year are self-studying for the exam, and this is certainly something that is very doable. As Rishav has just pointed out in his slides and tips, there is such a wealth of free resources and helpful information that is just out there and available for students to be able to use to prepare successfully for the MCAT exam. At the same time, MCAT courses and tutoring are also fantastic options. Sort of the nice thing about these approaches is instead of having to find the information yourself and figure out what you should do to prepare optimally for the exam, you can already work with people who have the experience of having this knowledge and can just tell you what to do. And of course, for those of you that are not sure, I'm sure you have plenty of time to figure this out. And if you're ever unsure what you should do to prepare for your exam, a great source are always your colleagues. So if you had any friends that did well in the exams, you can certainly ask them about what did they do that worked for them, and if they have any tips or recommendations. All right, so with that, why don't we go ahead and continue on to Catherine. But just before that, I just want to emphasize again that we are taking questions. So we have a good number of questions that have already popped up, but if you have additional questions, anything with how to use MCAT materials, what materials you should use, or just in general, how to prepare for the MCAT, please feel free to put in those questions. So now handing it off to Catherine.
Okay, thank you, Ken, and thank you, Rishav, for all the great tips. So we'll get started with my tips, and the first one that I wanted to talk about was the importance of the AAMC materials. I wrote that they're a must. And really, the AAMC is the gold standard, as Rishav said, and they created practice materials for us written by the test makers. You really can't get any better than that. And they're very close to the actual test, especially when it comes to those practice exams. So the practice tests especially are great for predicting your score on test day. In fact, most students actually score right on what they did on their last practice exam or within 1 to 2 points of that. So it's actually quite accurate for predicting your score, and this will help you in your studies because you can prevent having a situation where you would need to retake the exam, which is never the best situation to be in. So you can have a way of knowing how you'll do before test day. I really recommend doing the practice tests spaced out a little bit before test day, so maybe the last one a week before, and then the other one spaced out through the month before the test. There are only 3 that are scaled full-length exams, and then there's 1 full-length that does not have a scaled score. So those are really going to be the ones that you'll be taking and trying to extrapolate your score from, especially with the one that does not give you a score. Okay, and then my last point here is that You should always do them timed and review every single question, which Rishabh already told us, but I wanted to reiterate that point that it really is important. I see all the time students will actually get a question right, but they don't understand the rationale, and that doesn't help them for test day when they might be asked about that material and they don't fully understand. So always go back and review. And it's much more than, of course, reading the answer. It's all about being able to explain it to someone else. That's the level of mastery that you should have. So we'll move on to my second tip now. So yes, please read MCAT books. I have seen a lot of trending towards students just trying to watch the videos or avoiding MCAT books. And while students and universities are definitely moving in the direction of not having so many book resources and having more online or interactive resources, unfortunately for the MCAT, there's no one set of videos that has comprehensive content. So this means that you do need to read a whole set of MCAT books in order to know everything that is going to be on the exam. So another point with that is that you don't want to skip any chapters or skip material. Unfortunately, the way that you learned it in class is not going to be the way you need to know something for the MCAT, so keep that in mind. Finally, active study methods are a really big deal. I love talking out loud when I study, writing things out, color coding, even doing some tactile exercises like using my hands to sign things out if I'm confused. Really, there's a lot of things that you can do besides stare at the book. And you don't have to do the same thing for every chapter. So if you get bored of taking notes for a chapter, you can make a video of it or record yourself talking about it and make sure that you can speak coherently about the subject. So you can use a variety of methods to keep your attention on the books and retain the content. And we'll go to my last tip now. So my last tip is to supplement with non-AAMC practice questions. So this is important because you'll want to start applying the content that you're learning pretty early on. I say this because it's not unlike any other test that you've had. It's majority critical thinking rather than majority regurgitation. So you need to start understanding not only what content are they teaching, but how am I going to be tested about that content? The unfortunate news is, even if you purchased a nice new shiny set of books, the questions in them might have been recycled from the old MCAT, and they didn't rewrite new questions for the new MCAT. This is unfortunate because it really doesn't represent the exam too well. So I don't really recommend that students focus on the book questions. I prefer that students go to other resources like there's UWorld and there's the Next Step QBanks. And you can actually design blocks based on what you've been learning in your books and then test your understanding. And of course, like Rishabh said, if you don't understand something fully, you can always go back to your notes or to the books and or you can even watch a Khan Academy video really, and that will reinforce the content and make sure that you don't make the same mistakes again. So those are all of my tips. So just to recap, you should be reading books, using the AAMC materials, and then as you are studying, reading the books, I do recommend that you consult an outside resource for practice questions other than your books, because those will be much more high quality and representative of the exam.
All right, thank you, Catherine. So before we move on to talking about the med school coach, and now the med school coach might be able to help you with your presentation, I do want to enter in another poll, and then we can have a quick discussion on this as well. So the question is, how many practice tests do you think you should take before the MCAT? All right, so let's take a look at our results. So it looks like the majority is 10 or more. So of course, this is something that you might hear. You should do as many practice tests as you should, but I would actually say 10 or more is actually not the case for most students that succeed on their MCAT. In fact, for us at Med School Coach, the vast majority of our students take 4 full-length practice tests. I'm certainly glad that no one said 2. 2 is certainly too few. If you were paying attention to the presentation that Catherine was just giving about the full-length practice tests from the AAMC, there are 4 full-length practice tests from the AAMC, and those are the most representative practice materials available, so you should definitely be doing at least 4 practice tests. But now, if you look at the extreme of doing 10 or more, you'll find all sorts of people out there, some who will try to gather all the practice tests they can. So try to get 10 from the Princeton Review, 10 from Kaplan, 10 from Next Step, 10 from, all these companies, and their goal is to do as many practice tests as they can. But this is really quite a flaw, because what you should recognize about the MCAT is studying for the MCAT is not like completing a checklist. So if you do 30 practice tests, if you do 3,000 practice questions, you're not guaranteed any score on the exam. So it's not about how much studying you do. In the end, it's about focusing on the results, which is, are you able to answer MCAT questions correctly? And if you're not able to answer them correctly, what are you doing wrong? And what do you have to do differently in order to get those questions correct? So here at Med School Coach, we're actually about not making students do excessive work. The vast majority of our students only do the 4 full-length practice tests and do great on the MCAT, because it's not about doing a bunch of practice questions. It's about studying smart and studying efficiently, and learning from your mistakes and doing an intensive review of the practice questions that you're doing to see improvement. And also, just to reiterate another point that Rishabh and Catherine both made, when you do more practice tests, you're essentially forced to use practice tests from other companies, and the questions from other companies just aren't as good from the AAMC. Their questions are harder than they have to be. Their questions are written in a style that doesn't match the MCAT. And even when they have questions that emulate the MCAT, they have the incorrect distribution of those questions. They have an overrepresentation of certain types of question and an underrepresentation of other types of questions. So really, AAMC questions or the AAMC practice test, most important. All right, so to chat a little bit more about the Med School Coach and how we can help, and then afterwards we'll look at answering all the questions that we now have. We have quite a lot. Thank you for them. So the Med School Coach, our approach is really to provide students with everything that they need to succeed on the MCAT. So that includes both one-on-one tutoring and a video course that covers all of the highest yield concepts on the exam. So Rishabh and Catherine are 2 of our fantastic tutors, but all of our tutors are great. Unlike other companies, our standards are extremely, extremely high. So all of our tutors have scored at the 99th percentile for every section of the exam that they tutor. So they clearly know their stuff and what it takes to do well, but they also go through a very rigorous training process to make sure that these aren't just smart people, but these are people who are able to teach and effectively communicate their knowledge of science and strategies and techniques to their students. And for our video course, we talked about the Khan Academy video course, which is great. It's a fantastic free resource, and we highly encourage many students to use them. One weakness that you'll find with a lot of those videos, though, is that they can be a bit inefficient with explaining the concepts, which means in a concept that you could explain in maybe a few sentences or a couple minutes, you'll sometimes find that their videos are 10 to 12 minutes long. And because they have hundreds and hundreds of videos, they can really take you a long time to get through those videos, unless you're watching them at 1.5x or 2x speed, which many students do. So the video course that we've created, again, they're all designed by students who have done fantastic on the MCAT exam, and they're also concise videos. So that means they're going to get straight to the point of the important concepts and topics that you need to know without any, just extra information that's not important. In terms of how the tutoring works, when you sign up with us, you will be paired up with a tutor based on your needs, which we figure out based on your strengths, weaknesses, and goals. And when you work with us, we help you with whatever you need. And this is going to differ for each student. It's also the strength of tutoring. There are some students that need more help with content review. Perhaps there's a class in college that they always had a tough time understanding. And other students, it's not so much the content. Their knowledge of content is quite good, but it's an issue with strategy. They know the content well, but when they get to the test, they just don't know what to do next. They read the passage, it's confusing, they don't understand it. They get to the questions, they're also not sure what to do next. So whether it's with content, strategy, or a combination of the two, we're able to help. And in terms of our record for helping students, our average score improvement is 10 points. And this 10 points is either based on a previous MCAT score, so an official MCAT score, or for students who haven't taken an MCAT exam before, we have them take an AAMC practice test as a diagnostic test. So it is a reliable measure of improvement for our students. So with that, I just want to leave some more general information on this slide. If you want to learn about our satisfaction or score increase guarantee, the good thing about our situation is to date, we have yet to have any student ask for these guarantees. So we've really done quite well in helping our students improve their scores. And of course, if you have more interest in our programs, you can certainly visit our website at medschoolcoach.com. Or if there's any aspects of our tutoring program that you want to ask, feel free to email us at this email address right here, info@medschoolcoach.com. So now, for the rest of this presentation, what we're going to do is we're going to answer your questions. So now let's go ahead and take a look at the list that we have, and we're going to go ahead and start at the top. So for some of the questions that were asked more recently, it might take us a little longer for us to get there, but I guarantee we've got plenty of time today, so we'll answer as many as we can. So just a couple questions that we've had a few times, which is, first, will this be recorded and will you have access to these videos somehow? And yes, absolutely. So this webinar is completely recorded, as with all of our MCAT webinars. So you can find this recording on our YouTube page. So if you go to YouTube and look up Med School Coach, you'll find that we have a YouTube page, and you'll find this webinar on our YouTube page probably in a day or two. And you'll also find recordings of our previous webinars. So some of our webinars covered how to score high on the Chem Phys section and the CARS section, or how to design an effective MCAT study plan. So all of those webinars you can find online at our YouTube page. Okay, so here we've got a question. Rishav, I think you can take this one. The question is, what makes the real difference in getting that higher score after content review? Is it going through the content and making sure that you have all the detail memorized, or is it more doing practice tests and reviewing the practice tests?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that something that on the higher end of the scores, that the difference between like a 518 and a 522 is actually not very many questions at all. That the higher and higher you get, it gets hard to eke out those last few points, if that makes sense. And so it's like really like avoiding any mistakes. With that being said, in my opinion, I think this new format of the MCAT that has come out since 2015 has de-emphasized to some degree memorizing every single detail of every single like concept. And it's really about being able to apply these concepts and being like understanding how the MCAT likes to test things. In many cases, understanding like how research works and how to read a research paper. And so I think it's really the latter where you get like I think the content review will give you a big boost in your score, but to eke out those last few points are really hard to get. It's really like doing a content review or doing the practice questions and then reviewing those practice questions and really understanding what the questions are asking you. And as you do a lot of practice questions, what you tend to notice is that a lot of questions on the MCAT have some kind of like trigger word, I guess is the best way to call it, that without telling you exactly what topic you're supposed to be thinking about, they're like telling you in some kind of coded language what topic are you supposed to be dealing with, or what paragraph in the passage should you be going to look at that to find the answer here. And so if you do enough questions and you review enough questions, you start seeing those patterns. I think that's what really is the difference between a good score and a really great score.
Absolutely. And also, just to reiterate, this question is asking specifically about, how to get that high MCAT score. And, Rashab and Catherine are both 99th percentile MCAT scores. So that means they scored over 520 on the MCAT, which is an extremely high score. So in those cases, when you're aiming for that high score, practice does end up being more important. But not all students are going to be aiming for super high, scores like Rashab and Catherine got. There's no reason why you need to get that high of an MCAT score to get into medical school. So for a lot of students that aren't at that, high level on their practice test, there's a lot of progress that you can make by reviewing content. And there's also some differences between the sections. The psych-soc section in particular is very, very heavy on content memorization. Okay, so the next question here, Catherine, if you want to take this one, the question is, approximately how long should taking notes take? Because a 30 to 40 page chapter with written notes can take upwards of 2 to 3 hours.
Okay, so yes, taking notes takes forever. And that's a big problem for students, and the reason that students tend to burn out when they're studying for the MCAT, because they set goals that are just unrealistic. If you say you're going to read 5 chapters a day and take notes on them, it's just not going to happen. There are ways that you can increase your efficiency in note-taking. One of my favorite ways is to do a first pass on the chapter, where you read the first chapter and resist the urge to take notes at all. And then on your second read, that's when you can take notes. The reason that this is effective for increasing efficiency when you read is because you'll know more what's important after you've read the chapter once. So you can start seeing the big picture, the main ideas, and the terms that you have to know. At that point, taking notes is a lot less stressful because you realize that maybe I don't have to take notes on every little detail. I can capture just the big things. So if you're in a time crunch, definitely try that approach. With that being said, it usually does take 2 to 3 hours to properly read and take notes on a chapter. So you should plan accordingly when building a study schedule to account for all that time. There's really no way to get all of the content out of a chapter without spending at least 2 hours with it.
Perfect. And of course, when it comes to studying for the MCAT, it's not like you want to set a timer for each chapter, like I'm only going to give myself 1 hour to read each chapter. It's really taking as much time as you need to reach each chapter. Okay, so we have a quick question here, which is, when do signups open for July and August 2020 MCAT exams? So MCAT registration opens at 2 different periods. So test dates in the spring, so usually from January to May/June, opens in October of the previous year. So for those of you looking to take the MCAT next spring, you want to pay attention this October when the AAMC opens registration for those test dates. For those of you aiming for summer test dates in 2020, that registration usually opens around February of that year. So you'd be waiting around February 2020. We have another question here. The question is, Rashad, if I have Kaplan books for 2018 to 2019, can I use those same books for the MCAT in 2020?
Yeah, so I'm inclined to say yes, that usually if a student is purchasing books, I wouldn't recommend purchasing an old version of books. But the books, I think around 2015, 2016, the books started changing a lot when the new MCAT came out. I think the changes have slowed down a little bit since then. And so if it's 2018, 2019, you're probably okay, not much change in the last few editions. So I'd say it's okay to keep that book. But like I said, if you have the luxury of buying a set of books now, go ahead and buy a new copy of all the books, and don't buy like a used copy of an older edition.
All right, Catherine, we have a question for the cars section. What is the best way to improve cars from 124 to 128 or higher?
Okay, so that is a big increase, especially for the cars section. The car section is a beast for many students. It is material that most of us do not like, and it's hard to pay attention and answer the questions and learn from your mistakes because each passage is so different. What I would say is that I've tutored students who have had these score increases, and my approach with them was to have them do at least 2 passages a day of practice. And when you do practice, the review is really the most important part. So you should really understand what went wrong with your thinking and be very specific. Don't just say reasoning was wrong. Think to yourself, what did I actually think here? And specifically write out, oh, I thought this author was talking about this concept XYZ, but they were actually referring back to the other author's work and blah, blah, blah. That type of specificity in your review is what's going to help train your brain. It's kind of like instilling an algorithm in your brain of how the test makers want me to understand passages. So the more that you can train your algorithm, almost like how AI works, honestly, is just you want to take in as many practice passages as you can and continually train your brain to see the subtleties between the different answer choices. So the best way to improve is definitely practice. There's not a lot that you can do to learn how to do the car section other than practicing and learning good strategies and techniques.
Perfect. And of course, the car section is difficult for a lot of students, and a lot of students often think that the car section isn't a section that they can study for or prepare for, so they usually brush that aside, which of course can be a pretty fatal flaw because the car section is very important when it comes to medical school admissions. So it's not a section that you want to improve. And also, to add on to what Catherine was saying, it is a section that you can prepare for. So even though there's no content that you have to study, the MCAT has to make a card section that produces reproducible scores for students across many, many testing administrations. So that means they have the same types of questions that show up over and over again, and each question is going to require the same type of skill to answer those questions. So the better you can analyze those questions to learn the different types of questions and the specific approach you should take for each question, the more improvement you'll see with cars. Okay, so next we have a question here, which is, how long did you study for the MCAT, and how much time did you spend on content review versus practice? So I think both of you can take a stab at this. Rashab, if you want to go first.
Okay. So I think, so the first part was how long did I spend on content review or studying for the MCAT, and I would say I didn't spend enough time. I was working full time when I was studying for the MCAT, and so I was kind of doing it in the evenings and full time on the weekends, and so that was about 3 months. I'd say I put in about a little bit less than 300 hours. I'd say that a good range for how many hours you should be putting into studying is 350 to 550 hours. If you can really get to that 500 hours of studying, I know it gets very clear that students who put in the time get better scores, that it is a beatable test to some degree, that more preparation means higher scores. In terms of how much time you should devote to content review versus practice, it's a little bit difficult to answer because for most students, content review is done by reading, and some students are very slow readers and some students are very rapid readers. And so in terms of the content reviews, amount of time, I would say however long it takes you to get through all of the books, to take notes in all of the books. But I think it's an easier question to answer is how long would it take to do the practice questions? And so I would say at minimum, it should take you about 120 hours to get through all of the AAMC questions and to review all of the AAMC questions. And so make sure you have about 120 minimum hours remaining once you finish your content review to do just practice. but then the content review phase itself will vary from student to student, depending on reading speed.
Okay, and as far as what I did, I had an extended study schedule. So I actually started studying in March and I took the test mid-August. So I definitely took the long route, but it obviously paid off. So if you are a student who wants to get a really high score, that's probably the best way to go, is just to schedule a longer amount of time, because that's what allowed me to really dive into subjects and master them rather than saying, oh, okay, I have to move on. This has to be good enough. I really had the flexibility to learn things in great detail, and that really helped me on the test. As far as the number of hours, I think I calculated I did like 1,000 hours of studying, so definitely a crazy amount, but again, that's how hard you have to work if you want to improve your score by a lot. Additionally, as far as the question of how long I spent doing the content versus the questions, I think I spent about even time on both. So I spent half of my study time reading the books, and then once I completed them in about July, like early July, then for the next 2 months, basically, I was just doing questions. So like Rishav said, it does take about 120 hours. So it really depends on your schedule and how much time you have to devote to the MCAT. So essentially just make sure that you build a schedule that's customized to your own needs and don't just follow the schedule someone else made.
All right, great. So, Rishav, a question for you. I struggle with physics and more specifically with math, especially without a calculator. How can I effectively study for this section?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's like something that I encounter with a lot of my students, this like learning how to do math without a calculator. So there's a couple things I'll say. That the good news is that it turns out that most of the time the AAMC is not trying to trip you up with algebra skills. So I have noticed that a lot of prep companies, the amount of math that it takes to solve some of their problems is a lot harder than like most of the problems I see on the AAMC questions and the problems that I encountered on my MCAT. So there's some good news there. With that being said, you do need to learn a lot of like kind of new techniques to doing math without a calculator that you haven't probably encountered before. But it's actually like a trainable skill. So I'd say there's like 5 or 6 like skills that you need to be able to do math without a calculator. You should know how to round appropriately. You should know how to turn decimals and large numbers into scientific notation and do all your math and exponents. And so there's certain math skills that you need, and if you can master those math skills, like the math in the MCAT becomes quite easy. I'd say the biggest one is actually exponents. That for many of my students, they just get tripped up because you're multiplying, dividing, adding like huge numbers and small numbers all at once, and raising them to like crazy powers. And so if you can turn everything into exponents, it's actually quite easy. Maybe one last thing that I would recommend is please make sure you have all your sines and cosines memorized for those important angles. That should also make a lot of the physics much easier to do without a calculator.
All right, great. So we have a question here for Catherine. The question is, should we use our notes from class as a resource, or would you recommend using outside study material?
Okay, so I definitely heard that as a pre-med that I should save all my notes because I would need them for the MCAT. I didn't touch a single one of those notes because the MCAT is so different from my classes, and my class material is honestly a lot more dense than what the MCAT required of me, so I wasn't about to waste my time rereading all the hard things that I wanted to forget from my classes. So with that being said, definitely just get a set of MCAT books and don't worry about that advice to save your notes. I doubt you will use them. I really don't know anyone who used their notes to study for the MCAT, the notes from their classes rather.
All right, so we have a few quick questions I want to knock out. So the first is, if 6 months of studying for the MCAT would be too long? No, it would definitely not be too long. I would say most students preparing for the MCAT study between 2 to 6 months for the MCAT. 2 months is more so for students who are studying full-time over the summer. 6 months are for students who are studying during the school year and are taking classes at the same time. Of course, you also have students who are studying even earlier for their studies. So students who are studying, even a year before their MCAT because they really want to make sure they do well in the exam. And you also have some of those students who are able to pull off their MCAT prep in 3 weeks. Of course, those students who can do it in 3 weeks is definitely not many. And for a lot of those students who can, get a good MCAT score in a short amount of time, these are students who usually, start with a very strong baseline content knowledge. We also had some other quick questions about, which books are going to be the best. So I just want to repeat a response that Catherine Rashov gave earlier. Usually when it comes to MCAT books, the best books out there are from the large companies, so Princeton Review as well as Kaplan. This is simply because as large companies, they have the most resources for writing their MCAT books. So each year they're able to release a new edition of the books. And this is very important because when the MCAT releases new practice materials each year, the test prep companies use this material to update their books. So that way you will be the most prepared for your exam. When it comes to the smaller companies, and there's many out there, essentially any company aside from Princeton Review and Kaplan, they just don't have the resources to update their books regularly. So whereas Kaplan and Princeton Review are on their 4th or 5th editions of their books, most of these small companies are on their 1st or 2nd editions of their books. So some of their books might still be from 2015 or 2016. So just not ideal for the current exam. Okay. So here we have a question that Rashad can take. So the question is, how many hours should I study each day? Is 8 hours a day the best? And how should I be using that time each day?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of the number of hours per day, I think it kind of depends on your schedule. Like Ken said, if you have the luxury of studying full time, I think that's great. And then so if you don't have any other classes or any other like obligations, then you should definitely try and study full time, 8 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week. I would say take at least one, if you're doing that schedule, take at least 1 day off, because you're going to experience burnout really quickly if you're studying 7 days a week. And I'd also say somewhere in your schedule, build in like maybe a half day each week when you're doing just review. So you're looking through your notes, supplementing with videos, things like that. In terms of how you should, by the way, many people will not be able to do that if you're taking classes in college. If you have a full-time job, obviously you will not be studying 8 hours a day. Do not try to fit in 8 hours a day in addition to a full-time job or full-time studying, because that will also lead to burnout. So in the end, you just have, it's not the number of hours per day, but the total hours like cumulatively that you put in, I think is a better way to think about it. In terms of how you should distribute your time, I think early on, you're spending most of your time doing content review. And then towards the latter, like half of your studying, you're spending most of your time doing practice questions and review. Something that I recommend to my students when they're doing practice questions is to do them in about sets of 59 or 60 questions. AAMC sections for the science sections are 59 questions long. Spend 95 minutes doing those questions. Take a break after you're done with that. Go get a snack, come back, and then review those questions. And so all around, that's already 3 hours. And we do that twice a day. Do 2 rounds of that in a day, and you're already at about 6 or 7 hours. So yeah, I think it kind of changes depending on what phase in your studying you're in.
All right, and we have a question that Catherine can take. I've taken the MCAT already and already exhausted all of the AAMC practical materials. I want to retake the exam, but I'm concerned that if I retake the AAMC practice test, the scores may not be accurate predictors. What do you recommend I do?
Okay, so this happens to a lot of students, so you're definitely not alone. And I've worked with a few students who this has happened to as well. And having them repeat the questions really was not detrimental. It actually, per their own reports, they didn't really remember many of the questions. And even if you do remember some of the questions, if you're retaking the exam, that probably means that you did get a good amount of them wrong on your first time around. So there's always questions that you didn't get right the first time, and now you'll be hoping to get those questions right the second time. If this is a real problem, if you feel like you really are just remembering all of the questions, that's when you can turn to another resource such as UWorld for practice. But unfortunately, it just won't be as representative as the AAMC materials. So you should give them a try again and see how that goes.
All right, so with that, we're just about out of time. So a couple final points I want to make. So first of all, again, if you have any questions about the med school coach and how we can help you with your MCAT prep, any questions, feel free to send them to us at info@medschoolcoach.com. Certainly, you would have the opportunity to work with fantastic tutors like Catherine and Rishav. And finally, if you missed any part of this presentation, or if you wanted to watch any part of it again, this webinar will be up on our YouTube page in about a day or two. So aside from that, I wanted to thank all of you for taking the time to attend our webinar today. And of course, best of luck on your MCAT exams.